Hi, and welcome everyone to this webinar on using location intelligence to address transportation equity issues and how GIS can help us design more equitable transportation systems for the future. This is part of a series on advancing racial equity in state and local government, and we'd like to thank you all for attending today. So I'm Terry Bills. I'm the Transportation Industry Manager at Esri, and today I'm joined by several colleagues from Esri, including Grace Sammartino, who's an account executive on our transportation team, and by Jay Hagan and Paul Gears, who are solution engineers on our transportation team, and Koye Brown, who's on both our transportation and our racial equity teams. And today I'm particularly honored to have Keandra Siler-Dodds, who is the Executive Officer for Equity and Race at LA Metro, joining me. So I'd like to start the discussion today by saying I think we are at a critical moment in our thinking about transportation and in our thinking about transportation equity and in how we conceive of equitable transportation investments. Historically in the US, we've always operated with an unofficial 80-20 rule in terms of where we spend our transportation dollars, 80% on highways and 20% on transit. The problem with that formula is that we consistently underinvest in our public transit systems and in creating equitable transportation accessibility for all communities. And ultimately, I think we end up shortchanging the vitality of our cities. In essence, we overinvest in our suburbs and underinvest in our cities. And this is especially the case for lower income communities, often of color, who rely on public transit more than others to meet their mobility needs. And when I say that we're at a critical turning point, let me highlight the recent executive order instructing federal agencies to, quote, pursue a comprehensive approach to advance equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equal opportunity to strengthen communities that have been historically underserved. And that in turn has led the U.S. Department of Transportation to state that equitable and safe access to transportation is in fact a civil right. And we have the recent statement by the general manager of LADOT that the idea that no matter where you live, how much money you have, or who you are, you should have access to dignified, frequent, affordable transportation that serves all the needs that you have. So while it's one thing to say that we're at a critical turning point, the more difficult questions are how do we put those goals into practice? And how do we begin to rethink our transportation planning processes to provide for the mobility needs of all of our citizens and to build more equitable transportation systems for the future? So to help me discuss a few of those issues today, let me welcome Keandra Siler-Dodds, who, as I mentioned, is the Executive Officer for Equity and Race at LA Metro. So thanks for joining us today, Keandra.
Thank you for having me. And just quickly, I wanted to clarify how my name is pronounced. It's Keandra Kyler-Dodds, but I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for having me.
All right. So to start, I want to acknowledge that this really has been a challenging year for public transit agencies, and I think the pandemic has exposed longstanding inequities in our society, and the resulting ridership declines during the pandemic among transit agencies was really quite painful. And at the same time, I think that a majority of our transit agencies stepped up to provide the critical transportation services to our essential workers. And hopefully now, as we emerge from the pandemic, we have an opportunity to rethink our transportation systems for the future. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how LA Metro is grappling with these issues and how they're looking ahead to emerging from the pandemic?
Yes, glad to talk about this. So like most agencies, in the beginning of COVID, we had to pivot quickly. We experienced a severe ridership decline, though perhaps it wasn't as severe as some other agencies, but we knew that going into that point, we had Our ridership prior to COVID was mostly about 75% riders of color, 69% had incomes less than 25,000, and only 20% had incomes over 50,000. So as we saw our ridership drop from 1.2 million to 300,000 per weekday, those percentages only increased. And that was in large part due to the makeup of our essential workers in LA County. And so many of them using our system, while others who were able to telecommute stopped, many of them continue to use throughout the entire time and continue to today. And so we knew that our core riders, they were the ones that rely on transit to get to work, to get to the grocery store, to get to, the healthcare facility, to help us all through these really challenging times. And so we had to make sure that even though we had to reduce our service given our financial constraints and the severe ridership decline, it was important to maintain a sufficient level of service to support those still using the system and still relying on it and supporting the rest of our economy by using it to get to work and other key destinations. So while our ridership at one point reduced to about 30% of pre-COVID levels, service never went below 65% of pre-COVID levels. We made sure strategically that we were providing the quality level of service to get people where they still needed to get to. And so I think for us, more than ever, we really grappled with a lot of changing kind of scenarios and situations, a new reality really, but also with the fact that ridership may not always be our main measure of quality and of successful service. And so we had to get creative and think of ways that we could pivot to better meet the evolving needs of our community, both during the pandemic and afterwards as well. Just one quick example I wanted to share. We had a program at the time that had been launched as a pilot. It was called our Mobility on Demand program. And this was a pilot subsidized rideshare program really designed to enhance first last mile connections to rapid transportation for mostly vulnerable communities who may be excluded from private mobility providers like people with wheelchairs or people without smartphones or low income riders. And so at the time, we were providing it as a free service, and it had high ridership until COVID, after which ridership greatly declined. So we got creative and we pivoted to respond to COVID-19, and we made important changes to support the riders that still needed the service. But we suspended shared rides. We expanded the offerings. Instead of certain point-to-point rides, we expanded access to certain key destinations like grocery stores, and also added destinations outside of the service boundaries because it was within 3 particular communities, and expanded the hours. This allowed us to see an increase in ridership even beyond pre-COVID levels. And then excitingly, we also added a food and essential good delivery element to the program. And that allowed us to connect people to healthy food in a way where if they couldn't take transit, we would use transit to bring it to them. And it helped to serve single parent families with small children, families that were sick or otherwise had vulnerable members in their families, seniors, and for example, and unhoused families who had been temporarily housed in hotels. And so most of the recipients, they couldn't afford traditional home delivery groceries, nor did they have sufficient resources to pay for food oftentimes. And so this was really successful in bridging that mobility gap that we saw, and actually ended up being expanded by our board. And now we provide up to 750 food deliveries per week across 10 different neighborhoods. And so we're exploring the long-term future of that program, but that's just one of the ways that, COVID really elevated the importance of advancing equity through our system and increasing access to opportunities like food access. And so it also provided a new sense of urgency in figuring out how we do that well. So that's just one example, one of the ways that we're trying to be creative and responsive during these times and into the future.
Yeah, no, and I guess I would say I've been very impressed. I think LA Metro really has taken a leadership role. So, and in looking at my experience, just about every city and their respective public transit agencies really are grappling with many of the issues that you just discussed, the really sort of equity issues. And these aren't easy, or they're not simple issues, but but at a basic level, how do we begin to create more equitable transportation systems? And what does that look like? And how do we begin to reorient our thinking about transportation equity?
Well, thanks for the question. I think, this is an important question. I think the best way to start is by developing a shared understanding of our goals and what's meant by equity. At Metro, we define equity as both an outcome and a process to address disparities to ensure fair and just access to opportunities like jobs, like housing, healthcare, et cetera. And so, importantly, there's no one size fits all in determining the right process, but there are best practices. And it's really important that we focus on not only mitigating negative impacts, but really focusing on what benefits can we provide, especially to those facing the greatest disparities and the greatest barriers to access. Similarly, when it comes to outcomes, they have to be tailored to the community and the problem that you're trying to solve, and really focusing on people and the impact, and not just on users, but also the people living around the infrastructure and the people that will otherwise be impacted. And so one example that, one way that we're thinking about this is in our service plan improvements. We know that LA County residents, they need better access to jobs, childcare, and other key destinations. So we have to look at not only how we measure, kind of like the baseline access to all of these things, but also how we improve it, especially for those with greater transit propensity. And so we have an equity platform that really helps us think through and frame these issues. Its main objective is to increase access to opportunity, as I mentioned. However, there are 4 pillars that kind of help us get there. And so there's our define and measure pillar. Our second pillar is the listen and learn pillar. Third, our focus and deliver, and then lastly, our train and grow. So I know we're here today as part of a broader discussion talking about the ways that we define and measure using data. Listen and learning is about focusing on, the importance of community engagement, helping us understand, are we looking at the right problem? Are we looking at the right data? And helping us to ground truth that data. The focus and deliver pillar for us is really then how we plan for equitable outcomes based on, all the information we've gathered from data, from community engagement, et cetera. How do we get to those equitable outcomes, and how do we measure it to see if we're successful? And then our last piece is the train and grow pillar, which is really about educating and developing a diverse and inclusive workforce to help support this work, and help improve kind of the range of diversity in thought as we think about solutions and building better outcomes for the community. And then just to your last point about, how we reorient our thinking around these issues, I think, part of that depends on where your staff and your organization is starting from. But largely, it's important to start with a recognition of existing disparities and how they were created and how they are systemic in ways that impact our ability to move forward. If we don't understand those existing disparities and how the way they're built into our structures, and we aren't intentional about changing them, then our projects may continue to perpetuate them. But it's so important to really understand kind of our baseline and be intentional about how we're removing barriers, how we're addressing disparities, and so we can get to those outcomes.
Yeah, and I think, obviously we're all grappling with these issues. Hopefully we all can learn from each other as we move forward. I think an area where perhaps we've not done as good a job in the public transit community as we should have is really in understanding the particular mobility needs and the challenges really of our quite diverse communities. And while Title VI has always been a requirement for transportation agencies and public transit agencies, perhaps in practice it's not always been applied in ways that really help us to fully understand the different accessibility and mobility requirements in our various communities. And so can you maybe talk a little bit about the way that you think about these issues and how we should think about understanding the different mobility needs of really our different communities?
Yes. Well, thanks again for this question. First I'll say, admittedly, I'm not a Title VI expert, but I know that it helps us to ensure that certain changes do not create desperate impacts, particularly looking at race and income of our communities. I see Title VI as really a baseline. It's the minimum requirement, but we have to go above and beyond in order to truly advance equity. So, one of our more recent examples of where we did this was in our next gen bus plan, which was essentially an overhaul of our bus service system. After 30 years, it was a major overhaul, and the team really looked at not only understanding the racial and economic demographics of the communities within LA and where our transit routes kind of go through, but also trying to better understand transit propensity and access to key destinations. And so they came up with a transit propensity index that started with race and income, but also looked at other key indicators that helped determine likelihood of using transit and mobility needs. So they looked at lack of car ownership. They found a nexus between single parent households and transit propensity, and a couple other different factors. But they really tried to zoom in and understand where our communities were in greatest need, who was using the system, who had barriers to using the system, and then focused on maximizing benefits and created a system to look at baseline access to jobs, for example, and then looked at their new service plan and the different proposed changes to see, could it improve the number of jobs that you could get to from certain communities within a certain amount of time? So they were really intentional about trying to find other ways going beyond the Title VI analysis to improve access to opportunity for communities that have the greatest transportation and mobility needs. And I think it's that type of work that we have to continue to do in order to really make progress when it comes to advancing equity.
Right. And I think we certainly at Esri, sort of echo that comment that we really do need to go above and beyond Title VI, and we hope that what people are going to see today are some examples of maybe how we can begin to engage in that. And finally, I think most analysts looking at equity make the case that more equitable transportation systems need to fundamentally involve the local communities themselves in the decision-making process. And I know as a transportation planner myself, I know we've always struggled with this issue. Can you share your thoughts on not only how we make community involvement more meaningful, but how do we ensure that our planning agencies themselves reflect the diversity of the communities they plan for?
Yeah, this is another really important question, and one of the things that I'm really focused on at Metro. But I think part of this starts with just acknowledging the value that communities members bring to our work. Who knows their community better than someone living there and working there? Who knows our system better than people taking it and using it on a daily basis? Who knows better what the problems really are and their challenges as far as mobility and transportation than the people who are experiencing them? And so we should always keep this in mind and find ways to engage communities early on and throughout our planning and decision making processes. And note, I say engage and not just outreach. We really want to bring them into our processes, help work with them to design solutions, work with them to engage other community members. And there's many different ways of doing that. I think one way that I wanted to highlight is working with trusted community partners and community-based organizations to do more, to do better engagement. This month, we just released what we have called our Cbo Partnering Strategy, which is really meant to help us more consistently work with community-based organizations and make it easier for them by improving some of our procurement processes to really work with them on projects, not just community engagement, although that's one important factor. They can help us being trusted partners in their community, engage with certain populations that we haven't been able to historically, or we haven't done well. But then also we've partnered with CBOs in the past, and we want to do this more on actual designing of projects and studies. And so I think that's one way that folks can, engage in more meaningful community engagement. There's a lot of different other kind of best practices that are emerging. I think it's important to be creative and try and understand who's facing the greatest disparities or have the highest needs within your community, and how do you intentionally engage them, whether it be making sure you have the right your meeting is at a time that's convenient for them. It's in a location that is close to where they can easily access, that it's in a format that's accessible and welcomes people to be a part of the process and provides the information they need to meaningfully contribute to the project development process. And I think lastly, just on the point about the workforce, and there's a lot of things we could say about building a diverse and inclusive workforce, but as it relates to community engagement, I think it's so important to have a workforce that's reflective of the community, because in many ways that helps provide, one, a diversity of thought as you're thinking through these solutions and developing new projects and changes to your programming and services, but also it helps to build trust in the community to see themselves reflected in the staff. And it's a way to improve not only how we think about these solutions and the ideas that come from it, but also improve the trust and the connections with the community. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts. I think it's a topic where we could go so much into more detail, but I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, no, as I said, these are really the big questions, and we are all grappling with them, and we're working our way through these. But thanks, and it's been great to see the progress at LA Metro, and certainly I'm sure that you bear some of the credit for making that happen. So thanks again, and that really helps us set the stage for the next section of our webinar, and that's really making the case that location intelligence and GIS can, in fact, provide the framework and the tools to help us address these critical issues. So let me start by saying that location is central to questions of equity and inequality. And this is especially the case in transportation, where mobility and accessibility vary greatly, not only by where one is, but also fundamentally by one's life circumstances. So we've made the case in past webinars that ArcGIS provides a framework and the resources to apply a robust racial equity lens to a host of issues in our communities, from housing to healthcare, and today for transportation. So you're going to see a number of demonstrations designed to highlight that Esri technology is not only uniquely capable of helping you analyze racial and social inequities inherent in your transportation networks and services, but ultimately how to craft strategies and policies to help redress these historic inequities. And that's the real challenge in front of us. How do we create a more equitable transportation systems that serves everyone in the community? Because ultimately designing more equitable transportation systems often begins with public transit. We're going to start there. Lower income families often spend as much as 33% of their family income on transportation, which is almost double that of the average family. And yet accessible and affordable transportation is critical to a host of basic quality of life issues, and it helps to define the life chances for many lower income families. So understanding the mobility requirements of these communities is often the starting point for our analysis. So I'm going to turn it over to Jay Hagan, who will help us understand how Esri technology can not only help us define various communities of concern, but also how we can analyze and understand their mobility and accessibility needs. So Jay, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Terry, and thanks, Candor. That was a great discussion. I think we're going to see a lot of these themes come through today in these demonstrations. I'm really excited to be here today talking about this important topic of equity in transportation. As a former GIS analyst at a transit agency, I understand the challenges that public organizations face when it comes to procuring data, performing that meaningful analysis, and then sharing the results of that analysis, not only to internally to guide your decision making, but also for transparency with the public. So with that, I kind of want to jump in here and let's look at some real life examples of folks that are using spatial analysis to identify communities of need and in identifying gaps in service. So just to kind of set this up, ArcGIS gives you access to rich data, unique spatial analysis tools, and configurable web applications that are going to allow you to make data-driven decisions and share those findings with your stakeholders and with the public. So this first series of maps come from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission in Philadelphia. And the goal of the Equity Through Access project was to identify service gaps, recommend access solutions, and really ultimately empower communities to climb ladders of opportunity. As part of the project, the RPC created this ETA Priority Score Map Toolkit. And this web mapping toolkit demonstrates disparities in access to essential services, things like hospitals, clinics, recreational spaces, and so forth. So let's take a look at how the RPC identified their communities of need. The first step they took was to identify their vulnerable populations. And in this case, they wanted to look at households that included disabled persons, households in poverty, and people aged 65 or older, and they were able to map that. The next step was to identify those essential services that they had identified earlier. So activity centers, grocery stores, healthcare, and other recreational spaces. Where are those essential services located at? Now, combining those two, they're able to find a services mismatch. So those areas in the darker red, those are the areas that have a higher number of vulnerable populations, but less essential services within that community. Now, to pull all this together, they needed to look at the transit accessibility, because in some cases you would be able to use the public transit system to meet that gap. But then by bringing all of this together, they were able to create a final priority score and identify those neighborhoods that have a high number of vulnerable populations and no access to those essential services, either within their community or by using transit. This comes from the City of Portland Bureau of Transportation, and this is their equity matrix. And similar to the previous analysis, Portland used demographic variables to create an equity matrix. Now, instead of identifying gaps in transit service, Portland has chosen to look at some other inequities. Let's go to their Vision Zero tab here. So here we're looking at their equity matrix score along with traffic deaths and traffic injuries, and we can kind of see where these types of things are clustering. And later, Koya is going to actually go through a demonstration of looking at Vision Zero. This next tab that we're looking at here, this shows affordable housing. And just looking at this map, we can see there's a potential shortfall of affordable housing in the north and in parts of the southeast parts of the community. The City of Oakland DOT also developed their own equity maps. And much like Portland, Oakland wanted to look at traffic safety and housing issues. This map here shows urban displacement, or you might refer to as gentrification. And these are low-income communities that are high risk of displacement, which is a real issue in the Bay Area. This next map comes from Cal EnviroScreen, and it shows neighborhoods disproportionately burdened by and vulnerable to multiple sources of pollution. And I really like this because this is a great example of leveraging data that has been made available in ArcGIS from an outside agency. In this case, Cal EPA already calculated this pollution burden score, but they made the layer available to anyone to consume as a web service. All right, from Oakland, let's cross the Bay Bridge, and we're going to look at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. And I really like these maps. I think they look great, but SFMTA also made use of some really powerful network analysis tools in ArcGIS to look at employment access, and they wanted to look at access prior to COVID, during their COVID-related service cuts, and now that they're starting to do service restoration. And in this case, they use their local knowledge and their service equity strategy to take an in-depth look at access in 9 different neighborhoods. We're going to start off, let's look at Chinatown here. So Chinatown in San Francisco is one of the oldest and largest Chinese enclaves in North America. It's a vitally important neighborhood for Chinese immigrants. And as such, Chinatown residents face a unique set of challenges, whether that's poverty, language barriers, or lack to essential services. Here we can see what their transit service access looks like in a 30, 45-minute, and 60-minute transit service area prior to COVID, during their COVID service cuts, and now that they're starting to restore here in May. They were able to do some geo-enrichment to determine how many jobs these folks have access to. And we can see here that within 45 minutes, they actually lost access to 4% of jobs. However, you can see here that this neighborhood fared better than more affluent non-equity neighborhoods. And many of those neighborhoods saw a 20 to 40% decrease. Hunters Point, along with Bayview, is often considered San Francisco's most isolated neighborhood. This is a very diverse neighborhood, and it's home to San Francisco's highest percentage of African Americans. And as such, there's a history of redlining and marginalization in Hunters Point. And actually, this neighborhood is a designated, USDA designated food desert. I really like this example though, because this shows how you can use analysis to identify a need and take corrective action. We can see their pre-COVID service area here compared to their current service area. They were able to increase access to jobs from 33,000 jobs to 326,000 jobs within a 45-minute transit shed. That's an 864% increase in job access by adding an express route. I think that's awesome. So what really sticks out to me about these examples is how each one of these agencies used a variety of data sources, and they performed powerful spatial analysis to guide their decision-making, but each one tailored their analysis to account for local factors. Delaware Valley used a priority score that looked at population services mismatch, while Portland used an equity matrix consisting of demographic factors to identify areas of need. San Francisco here used transit network analysis looking at employment access in 9 neighborhoods of need. But in each case, these agencies leverage powerful analytical tools and ready-to-use data with Arcgis. Let's kind of stay on this theme here of network analysis, and we're going to look at some more examples here. This series of maps and analysis was put together by Melinda Meringue on Esri's network analysis team. Melinda does a great job of explaining the value of analyzing transit accessibility, and she's put together some really interesting and engaging examples here. And we're going to jump ahead a little bit. We're on this series of maps, and we're looking at employment access. And this particular example shows census blocks that are accessible from a location of interest, which is shown in red. Might be a little bit hard to see on the screen there, but that's our location of interest. And this is showing a 30-minute travel time only walking or using public transit. And we're looking at a specific time in this case, 6:30 a.m. However, the time of day matters. Let's look at accessibility from that location just 2 hours later at 8:30 a.m. You can see a little bit of a difference here, and it might not look like much, but using Esri geo-enrichment tools, we can calculate the number of jobs available in this area. And your job access goes from 151,000 jobs in a 30-minute travel time down to 105,000 jobs. That's a huge cut. Let's take this a step further now. So frequency of transit matters too. So right now we're looking at the area accessible by at least one trip within a 30-minute transit or walk service area during the morning rush hours. However, we might ask ourselves, what's accessible 90% of the time? There's at least one trip that can get me to all of these locations, but 90% of the time, I can only access this area. Looking at those jobs again, I might have access to 204,000 jobs, but 90% of the time, I can only get to 67,000 jobs, and that's a significant difference. And Esri offers these unique capabilities for performing this type of analysis. Here's one more example. This is something I've been working on, and I wanted to look at healthcare. So these points here, we're looking at hospitals, clinics, and doctors' offices. Of course, healthcare is important not only for the health and well-being of folks, but also they tend to be really good employment centers, particularly hospitals. So by doing analysis and looking at how accessible these places are by transit, we can see here these areas in the darker blue have better access, while areas in the lighter blue have less access to these locations. So this is showing us a potential gap. However, we can bring in some other layers for context to explore what type of need there might be. And just to show you that you have access to this information, you can browse your Living Atlas layers here. I can bring in a CDC vulnerability layer. We're looking at transportation vulnerability. I've already added that here. And by adding this in now, those areas in the darker purple show a higher transportation vulnerability. So now I can kind of put the two together and see some locations that stick out as having a potentially high transit need, but not much transit access in this particular location. Now, just looking at this might not give us quite the context that we need here. We can pull in other information, like the predominant race, for example, or maybe the language spoken at home. And just looking at this area here, it turns out that English is not the predominant language in this particular location. So using this to really dive into that intersectionality and learning more about your communities. So what you're looking at here, this is an output of network analysis that I've done. And this analysis could seem intimidating if you've never built a network data set, for example. But Esri not only gives you the data and tools for doing this, but we also have a number of resources to help get you started. We have Arcgis Learn Lessons in which you solve a problem using data. We have tutorials with downloadable data as well. There's blog posts about this, and of course, the software documentation. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about some other facets of transportation equity, and specifically community engagement. So communication and transparency is really important in public transit. It's a public service, and it really relies on timely communication. So this is our hub site for transit equity. We want the site to be accessible to everyone, so we have tools to translate here really quickly. Also, hub sites can be designed to be 508 compliant under ADA guidelines, so it's really just giving everyone access to this. Let's just take a quick look at what we can do here. So this is a configurable site. We can embed videos, messages from our leadership. It's a nice place to talk about what your focus is and what initiatives you have. So not just transit service for us, but we're looking at police. We're looking at economic inclusion, civil rights, environmental justice, our agency workforce, which Koya is going to go into a little bit more detail in. Providing some metrics, and these metrics can be updated in real time on how well we're performing in these key areas. So how many reduced spares have we given out? How quickly are we resolving our citations internally? The opportunity for the community to share feedback. Of course, we always want to have that two-way communication there. Key program areas, so providing additional information, videos. The ability for the community to follow this initiative, stay engaged. Events that could be coming up that the agency should be, that the agency wants to promote and wants the community to take part in. So not only is this a great communication tool, it's an awesome coordination tool as well. You can share data and content with your trusted community partners, such as not-for-profits. Now looking here at the top, you can see I have a number of different tabs here. And let's take a few minutes here to explore some other ways that we can engage with our community. So we talked a little bit about Title VI, just a little bit of extra background. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination in programs on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And many transit agencies extend that policy to prohibit discrimination to other protected groups. And as such, there's some requirements set by the FTA that apply to most public transit agencies in the United States to ensure they're meeting those needs. One of those requirements is providing citizens a method to file a civil rights violation, and we can link to a configurable survey form here to collect that information. Another significant requirement of Title VI is performing a service equity analysis, and this analysis must be completed and submitted to the FTA every 3 years or after a major service change. So after reducing service during COVID lockdowns, our transit agency did an equity analysis. Let's take a look at how we did that. Title VI requires us to look at transit service and how it affects populations of color and low-income populations. So here we're looking at our reduced service evaluation. All of this analysis can be performed in a browser, and we can just load local GTFS data. We can utilize ready-to-use demographic data sources from Arcgis and run spatial analysis as cloud services. And you can see just kind of looking here, I'm not buffering linear routes. I'm actually doing walk time analysis around each individual stop. So I can really get a true sense of what type of access we have here. By using a chord visualization or different charts, I can start to look at the intersection of poverty and race here. And that's going to help me identify communities most impacted by my service changes. All of these steps are recorded in a model, which is great for documenting our process and what we've done, but it also allows us to rerun this analysis by loading a new GTFS data set. Now, as Terry and Kendra talked about, this is a good starting point. This is kind of a traditional Title VI analysis, and it helps us meet that federal reporting requirement. However, if we really want to look at examining equality, we need to disaggregate our data. We want to look at populations with a lot more granularity and look at other disparities. So in this case, I've run the exact same analysis, but I've run this just for the Black population. I just chose St. Louis here, but you can see here that we can, by having all of this in a model, I can just plug in new data sources and get a completely different type of analysis. And then, of course, we can share this out with the public. So looking at how each population group is impacted, and even calling out if we're not quite making our service standards, or even looking at language differences as well. So really, this could be how Title VI could and maybe should be done moving forward. Of course, you have access to unique analytical tools and data with ArcGIS. Here we're looking at some Esri maps for public policy. These are curated maps that you can quickly grab and package together. Of course, we can share out the results of analysis that we've already done. Crowdsourcing data. So this is that listen and learn part, providing tools for the community to engage with us. So here we've embedded a trip survey. I'm going to open this in a new tab, but this gives us an opportunity to maybe collect more focused information from our specific community. So in this case, we want to learn about difficult trips. Where are you commuting from? Where are you going? How many transfers and how long does it take you to get there? This is a configurable survey that allows us to explore specific demographic factors when evaluating transportation service. Of course, we're aware of that digital divide. You can load this onto a mobile device and you can send folks out into the field, go to transit centers, and perform in-person interviews to collect this information. Finally, I want to wrap up with stories. Maps, charts, and data are great. They're awesome. But when you bring all of that content together to tell a story, it's very powerful and persuasive. It's just a better and more effective way of communicating with the public. And here's some maps we've curated about racial equity. These are publicly available. I would encourage you to find these and look these up. There's some incredible stories in here. I want to take a look at this particular story here. This is a Arcgis Story Map. It's configurable, and this is telling the story of transit issues facing Washington, D.C. So as we scroll down here, you can see this is providing a multimedia experience. I have text, I have maps, you can embed charts, videos, photos, just a really nice way to bring all of this together and tell a nice story. So to summarize, ArcGIS provides a rich library of data, these unique spatial analysis capabilities, and highly effective ways of communicating with the public. I really appreciate this opportunity to share it with you, and I'm going to hand it back to Terry now.
Okay, thanks, Jay. So now we're going to turn from public transit to a broader transportation programs and how we look at a full range of transportation investments from an equity perspective. So with that, let me turn it over to Grace Sammartino and our transportation team. So Grace.
Thanks. Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Jay. That was you showed some really powerful, comprehensive tools to support equity analysis specific to public transit. My name is Grace. I'm an account executive supporting highways and roads customers for Esri. We're going to build upon what Jay showed and provide some additional examples that incorporate a multimodal view of highway projects in order to make the best use of your infrastructure investment dollars. So for the next 3 minutes, I'm going to provide some background on the issue, why location matters, and a recommended approach to framing equity. From this presentation, our goal is that you walk away with 3 key points. First, we want to show you a way that organizations can apply a racial equity lens to examine and address inequities through geospatial analysis tools. This lens incorporates not just race and ethnicity, but the intersection across religion, language, nationality, sexual orientation, gender, as well as social characteristics that speak to class like income, home ownership, and more. And I want to add what Keandra said. It also implies a recognition of systemic disparities, all of which either impact or is impacted by location, where people live, work, and play. Next, by understanding where these patterns exist, you can make thoughtful decisions on future programming. And finally, we're going to demonstrate how you can improve access to underserved communities so the decisions you make today will drive positive outcomes and equitable conditions across your community assets. And we've talked with transportation agencies across the country. We've heard common themes. First, agencies need to better understand where their communities of concern reside. And it's very unique to each agency and each community. And we understand that there are federal mandates behind compliance and transparency to help redress previous racial and social justice inequities and to accelerate progress and positive outcomes. And the goals are not to make sure your organization is compliant. It's really to make sure your transportation investments are fairly and equitably distributed and communicated through the appropriate channels. And to support your organizational efforts, Esri has provided a GIS framework of capabilities to determine your approach. And Terry referred to this framework at the start of the webinar. In this next section, we're going to focus on examples of racial equity configurations to help operationalize racial justice, to increase opportunities for communities of concern, and reduce their undue burdens. So I hope that provides you context on why location does matter in advancing transportation equity. Now, here's some quick background on what you're going to see today. The first series of demos will provide a community-based approach in exploring spatial inequities and successes, as well as a project-based approach of benefits and burdens, followed by a people strategy around equity. And with that, let me hand it over to Koye Brown for an analysis on communities of concern. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. Hi, I'm Koye. Most state DOTs already have some kind of equity analysis or weighted multi-criteria score they use to prioritize projects in order to get the most value from their investments. Today, we're going to go through a process to spatially set priorities around programming and projects to identify areas to focus funding and investment decisions. I'm going to walk through a little of the technicals, so developing a priority score, performing spatial analysis, that can all be used to support decision making. Let's jump into our demo. We use a process from Oakland DOT to create a priority score. We're using these scores to identify areas to focus resources. We've pulled census data using the Census Data API to include these factors: people of color, income, persons with disabilities, seniors, single parent families, severely rent-burdened households, and low educational attainment. We performed some data compilation and used these factors to calculate a weighted average. Let's check that out. We did all of the data preparation in Arcgis notebooks because it makes it easy to share, document the process, and to do on-the-fly visualizations. In the end, we weighted people of color and low-income households as most important, representing 50% of the overall score. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to share. Now from here, we can visualize this on a map. So let's see the results. We're using maps to visualize our priority score. That helps with equity strategies for service delivery organizations like DOTs. Here, we're really thinking about where to allocate resources. How do we best leverage our investment dollars? And are we serving our communities in an equitable way? This map shows low to high scores from light to dark, with the dark areas having the highest priority score. But how do we make this actionable? We're going to look at crashes to identify dangerous roads. Let's jump into our analysis of crashes in space and time. We're looking at 5 years of data for fatal and severe crashes. Using an emerging hotspot analysis, we can look at patterns in the data, showing consecutive hotspots and then new hotspots. Now we want to associate each crash with the underlying road network to look for crash hotspot locations. Here's the result of our analysis. The red segments are the most dangerous roads. And these are the areas where we really want to focus and look at improving traffic safety by lowering fatal crashes and severe crashes. From here, we can start to identify the policies, programs, and projects that can improve safety for this area. So let's wrap up. We've just seen some examples on building a priority score, then taking that to know where to allocate resources. We use spatial analysis to visualize patterns of crash trends, then took that a step further to identify hotspots along our road network that were then overlaid with our priority score to identify areas for policy, programming, or projects to improve traffic safety. I hope this provides you with some ideas that you can build upon within your organization. And with that, I'll hand it over to Grace.
Thanks, Koye. And you've just seen a way that Esri's data science and hotspot analysis tools can help you impact your communities of concern in this scenario regarding safety management. Paul's going to show you two examples of advancing transportation equity. The first demo is going to apply a micro-focused lens on a transportation disadvantaged community use case, followed by a project view of analyzing benefits and burdens. Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Grace. So next we're going to take a look at two practical examples of how the ArcGIS platform provides data management and analytic tools to help DOT planners make informed decisions about programs and projects through an equity lens. This first example is from the Florida Commission for the Transportation Disadvantaged. The commission is a statewide effort to provide demand-responsive shared ride services to children at risk, seniors, disabled, and low-income residents who are typically underserved by existing fixed mass transit. Esri was requested by the Florida Department of Transportation to help the CTD better understand their ridership and the communities they reside in. Here we've taken spreadsheet data of trip data from two county programs, Baker and Hernando counties, and we've transformed this data into geolocated data on riders, enriched with data from the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, the one that Jay talked about earlier. This dashboard visualization decomposes the index to display just those components that apply to the Commission's mission to serve specific at-risk communities. It allows analysts and planners to explore the data geospatially, providing at-a-glance access to underlying demographics. In general, the dashboard shows ridership is clearly coming from lower income, senior and disabled communities. And it appears that having no vehicle is not necessarily a factor. If we zoom into Baker County, we see that more at-risk children are represented here in the persons under 17 and single parent households. While in Hernando County, the ridership is clearly coming from areas with persons over 65 and persons with disabilities. The next example uses the state of Massachusetts Index for Identifying Environmental Justice Populations, or EJ populations. This is similar to the index that Koye showed us. In this case, we leverage the analytic power of ArcGIS Insights to do three things. First, we've downloaded project center lines from the Massachusetts DOT Open Data Portal. Next, we've created a quarter-mile buffer around each project, simulating the communities in the immediate vicinity of the project who are most directly impacted during construction or really during the the completion of the project itself. Next, we then enrich this buffer with demographic information on households in the vicinity using Insight's geo-enrichment tool, which gives us access to a rich repository of Esri curated demographic data. We can then use the demographic data to classify the projects and their adjacent communities according to the index. So now DOT planners can explore relationships between project types and communities they impact, as in this chord diagram. The chord diagram is showing EJ populations and non-EJ populations around the right side of the chord. And these populations are connected to project types, with the chord width actually representing the total population as classified. So now a DOT planner can assess the community impacts of particular project types, whether they're beneficial, something like resurfacing, for example, or more burdensome, and the classic example there being highway construction. Here we can drill down to see that the predominant miles of highway projects for non-EJ populations are running through rural areas with relatively low populations, while significant EJ populations are being impacted by highways projects in particularly in the urban areas. We can see how they cluster in the Springfield and Boston area. This may lead us to take a closer look at how we mitigate burdensome impacts of these projects, thus providing for a more equitable distribution of both benefits and burdens to the communities and ensuring positive outcomes for all. So these are just a few of the many ways that ArcGIS tools can empower DOT planners and analysts to understand their service communities through an equity lens. Grace?
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Now we're going to switch gears, and for the final demo, we're going to showcase an introspective approach on organizational diversity and demo a sustainable and inclusive workforce. I'll hand it over to Koye.
Thanks, Grace. Transportation workforce issues are complex. With more than 50 state DOTs and nearly 6,000 transit agencies, each having their own set of responsibilities, organizational structure, history, and culture, there's a growing need for building capacity through talent pipelines for workforce they need to function. Increasingly, agencies need to ensure that their workplace reflects the diversity of their communities. This dashboard allows us to visualize and assess workforce diversity. Showing representation is important in any industry, including transportation, in order to build back trust and connections between government, constituents, and communities. Folks want to know things like who's at the table, who's contributing to important conversations, who's in charge for planning and distributing of resources and services, or who's addressing current issues like inclusivity. This offers a way to be transparent about your current workforce and goals. If we take a look at the first three percentages, we'll notice that hiring of Hispanics is underrepresented compared to their community makeup. If we took this to make this actionable, organizations could take this and address hiring needs like set targets, prioritize building internal pipelines through growth or succession, or have strategic initiatives for external pipelines to hire from Hispanic communities. Next, we have the details page. It provides key breakdowns and combines race with other factors like gender and years of service. This view can be used to address slow-moving things like pay equity, or be leveraged to get real about setting up pipelines to hire, let's say Hispanic women engineers. Now let's wrap up. Work and workers are changing. Establishing a diverse portfolio of talent pipelines will only help build a sustainable workforce. This dashboard allows you to input your own data and look at your own workforce to the communities you serve. It can sit on your hub site as a way to communicate your progress with the community. With that, I'll turn it over to Terry.
All right, thanks, Koye. And so I'd like to just reiterate Grace's three takeaways. I hope that we've provided a few powerful examples of how GIS can help you and your agency apply a racial equity lens to transportation service delivery and investment. It gives you the framework, as you saw, to identify the racial inequities in your transportation systems. It helps you power analysis that lets you make better and more equitable decisions for your community. And finally, it helps to ensure that you're providing equitable service for all of your citizens. So what are your next steps? So we have provided a number of links to help you learn more, not only about what ArcGIS can do to help you address historic transportation inequities, but also what Esri is doing to help support your efforts. I encourage you to take a look at these sites, as well as to sign up for future webinars in this series. And feel free to reach out to not only anyone on this webinar, and we have the list below, but also to our racial equity team for further information. And then finally, if you could take a few minutes to fill out the survey, which will appear at the close of this webinar. It's just a few short questions that will really help us to understand your needs. And you can influence our work on data and guidance and resource development to better suit your needs. And so with that, please, if you have questions, type them into the question and answer box. I don't think we're going to have a great deal of time today, but to answer those questions live. But we will respond to all of your questions. We'll make sure that you do receive an answer and a follow-up as well. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I want to thank all of you for attending today. I especially want to thank Keandra for participating today. I think this has really set a great sort of example, and I hope that we've helped any number of transportation agencies begin to think about how we can address these issues moving forward. So again, with that, I want to thank you for attending. And again, I want to thank everyone for participating. So with that, thank you. Bye-bye.